My name is Ernest Schmidt. I'm your facilitator for this business law course. I've been teaching this course both in class and online for approximately 20 years. So I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to the course. It's important to know that there's a lot of reading in this course, but I've designed the course with a view so that the reading is going to enhance your learning experience rather than detract from it. So that's, I think, something you should keep in mind when you feel that you're kind of overwhelmed with the amount of reading that has to be done for this course. One other thing I'd like to mention is that quite often I get questions in emails from students about certain topics, and what I would like to say is that please take the time to familiarize yourself with the course website, because quite often the answers to those questions are on the website themselves, and I think it's an efficient use of everybody's time that you take the time to learn and see what's on the website before you send me a question. Okay? Now, the purpose of these video tutorials are to essentially enhance your learning experience. In other words, what I try to do here is to explain things in a simple way, and I sometimes discuss matters that are not talked about in the textbook. So hopefully these will supplement your learning in a very positive way. Now let's talk about probably the most important and first part of the course. That's what exactly is law? Well, law is a set of rules and principles intended to guide our conduct in society. These rules and principles can often apply to a business, whether it's a sole proprietorship, a corporation, or a partnership. Okay? Now, how law fits into society is such that we are actually a society governed by laws and not by something called the rule of man. Okay? In other words, it's not a president, head of state, monarch, or a prime minister that tells us what we have to do. It's essentially the law that binds us in terms of how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in society, while a prime minister or a head of state or a monarch has a role in making that law. Ultimately, the law is a body of rules and principles you can determine by itself. Okay? Now, it also means that our system adheres to something called the paramountcy of the rule of law. Okay? That means the rule of law is supreme over the acts of government or its people. Okay? While the government wants the law to be enforced or determined a certain way, it's really ultimately up to our court system or our judges to determine how the law is to be enforced or to be applied. Now, this is somewhat frustrating for a government at times because they may disagree on how a judge or a court makes decisions, but ultimately the courts have the power to do that, and once a judge is appointed, that judge is appointed to act in an independent and an impartial way to make the decision based on how he or she sees the law. Okay? Now, there's a couple of other fundamental legal principles that are the basis of what we call the rule of law. One is that our judiciary, or our courts, are separate and independent from those individuals who enact the laws. Okay? I've already talked briefly about that. Another principle is that no person's above the law. The law applies to everybody equally and should be enforced equally, applied and applicable to everyone. Another important principle you should know about is that no one should be punished unless they've breached a specific law. In other words, you cannot be punished for acting a certain way, okay, or merely because someone doesn't like the way you look, okay? You have to violate a certain or specific law, okay? So that's important to keep in mind. Another thing, which you've probably already heard of, is that ignorance of law is no excuse, okay? We're all expected to understand and know what the laws say and how we're supposed to react. That's not always realistic, and sometimes if you didn't know about a law, it might be taken into account when it comes to your punishment or penalty that you are to be faced with. Okay? There's also an important distinction I want you to know about in terms of what law is and what justice is. Justice is actually the notion of how the laws apply or enforced. And justice really entails fairness. In other words, we expect justice or fairness when the law is applied or enforced. Okay. So where's this thing that we call law? Where does it exist? Most of the time it's written down somewhere. Okay. For example, governments make laws, and these laws are called statutes. Okay. You can go to a library and look under a certain heading, and you'll find, or a an act of parliament or an act of provincial legislature or a municipal bylaw. Okay, and this is what we call ascertainable law or positive law. Okay, and I want to highlight a difference here between positive law and morals, ethics, and values. If you murder somebody, you're going to be brought before a court of law, and that court of law is going to charge you with a breach of a positive law or a statute law, a law that's written down somewhere. Okay? For example, you're going to be charged with violating the criminal code. You will not be charged with, let's say, violating one of the 10 commandments. As you know, one of the 10 commandments says, "Thou shalt not kill." Okay? Now, there's a common element with respect to the statute law and the moral law under the 10 commandments, and that is they both want to uphold the sanctity of life and the right to live and the right not to kill somebody. Okay? So there's a common element there. And quite often, the statute law or the positive law tries to uphold the morals of society and the ethics and values of that society. So they do sometimes coincide, but not all the time. And let me give you an example. Let's just say you're sitting home one night having supper and someone knocks on your door trying to sell you something. Well, you might be morally offended and say that person's violating your right to privacy and they shouldn't be disturbing you, okay, morally. But unfortunately, that person's really not breaking the law if he's licensed, you know, under a municipal bylaw by doing so. Okay, so that's an illustration of where your moral sanctity or your moral principles do not coincide with illegal activity. Okay? Okay. So it's important to know that some law does not originate from a statute or legislation. For example, a lot of the law pertaining to tort law is based on common law or what we call court judgments. Okay? This makes the finding and determination of the law a bit more challenging. In other words, you have to conduct researches or court cases or court decisions to determine how the law is determined and what it means. And once you find a case that you think applies to your situation, you have to still determine the likelihood of whether that case will apply or be upheld in your situation. That's when quite often a person will rely on expert advice such as a lawyer. That lawyer can assist you in interpreting the previous court decisions and helping you see how that would apply to your situation. Okay? Let's just, for example, the common law or court-made law or judge-made law says that we have a duty, each and every one of us have a duty to act or take reasonable care in the conduct of our daily activities or business activities. Okay? You can't go to a library and look up a statute and it says that, okay? You have to know that this comes from an obligation that the common law places upon you. Okay? So, that obligation to take reasonable care is out there. When you're walking around on the streets or when you're driving to work, that's out there. You have to take reasonable care when you interact with other people. Okay? That's a bit more different and a bit more difficult to determine in a case-by-case situation than something like saying, let's say, going through a stop sign. Okay? We all know the Highway Traffic Act says that if you go through a stop sign, you're violating the law. It's illegal. Okay? So it's a lot more easier to determine the law or whether or not an action is illegal based quite often in a statute situation. Okay? Okay. Now, let's say you have a business and there's something that may injure somebody on your business premises. You might have to look through the common law to determine whether or not if you didn't warn someone, that would be illegal about that dangerous activity, okay? So, as you can see, quite often it takes a bit of analytical thinking to determine what the law is or how the law will apply to your situation. Okay. So we've talked about law created by the legislature, statutes, and you can go to the library and look them up. We've talked about judge-made law. You can also actually go to the library and look those cases up too, in case reporter series. And there's one other source of law that's really important for businesses, and that's what we call the law of contract. Okay? A contract often states the rights and responsibilities between two parties, or more than two parties, entering into that contract. For example, a lease will state what a tenant has to do, i.e. pay the rent, and what a landlord has to do, i.e. keep the property in good state of repair. Okay? Now that contract is actually a body of law predetermined and made and agreed upon by two individuals. Okay? So that's an entirely separate source of law, okay? It's not a court telling you what a landlord's supposed to do, okay? So, mind you, often you can go to a court to interpret the contract if there's a dispute or someone's breached a contract, okay? So it's quite important to know that contract is an important asset in the conduct of business activities, okay? Now, one thing the courts will do with respect to contracts is they really feel it's important to uphold the system of contracting. In other words, they really don't want people walking away from contracts if they breach them. They feel that contracts have to be enforced, and that for the purpose of the economy, it's important to have businesses have reliable contracts, and for them to know that if they breach a contract or somebody else breaches the contract, then the court will enforce that contract to avoid that behavior from reoccurring. Okay? So that's really an important aspect to know about contract law. So in essence, what I'd like to sum up is that we've got the various sources of law. We've got the statute law, or provincial laws, or you could say municipal bylaws. That's basically really easy to determine. You go to a library, look up what that particular law says. Then we have a series of court judgments which could apply also. That's something a bit more difficult, which will quite often, more than not, require the assistance of a legal professional to determine what obligations could be arising out of those court decisions. And then we have contract law. Okay, quite often you hear when there's a contractual dispute, the lawyer will say the first thing you should do is, what does the contract say? Okay, and try and determine what rights and responsibilities flow from what the contract says. If that doesn't work, quite often the court has to be called in to assist in that whole area. Okay, well anyway, thank you for your time.